Walk into any decent-sized city in the West and, well, chances are you'll stumble upon a yoga studio.
Oh, absolutely. They're everywhere.
It's become this incredibly common activity, often just thought of as, a good workout.
A way to get flexible, maybe de-stress a bit.
Exactly. But that makes you wonder, has it always been purely physical or just seen that way?
That's a great question.
And that's what we're diving into today. Is yoga fundamentally exercise, or does it tap into deeper religious origins? Which, of course, sparks some pretty complex debates about its history and, well, how we practice it now.
Right. In today's deep dive, we're going to unpack the history, the practice, and the philosophy of yoga. We're drawing from a really informative video transcript from the Let's Talk Religion YouTube channel.
Good source.
Yeah, trying to understand the surprising evolution of, how yoga journeyed from ancient India to become this modern Western phenomenon we see. And crucially, how all these different phases are actually interconnected.
Because what's immediately apparent, isn't it, is that yoga's story isn't simple.
Not at all.
It's not some direct, unchanged line from an ancient practice straight to our studios today. Nor is it purely a modern invention, something cooked up recently.
Right. There's much more nuance there.
There's a lot more to unpack. We're going to explore the inherent diversity of yoga and its fascinating interactions with various traditions over literally thousands of years. Okay, so to start, where does this whole story begin? Where do we look first?
Well, the origins of yoga are firmly rooted in India. That much is clear. It arose within a very vibrant, very rich religious and philosophical landscape.
Okay.
However, it's really important to understand right away that there wasn't like a single founder figure or one definitive inaugural text that just said, boom, here's yoga.
Okay, so no single inventor.
Exactly. The beginnings are much more intricate, developed over a long period.
So no clear starting point like we might think of for some other traditions. Given its current reach, that kind of makes sense, I suppose. But when did the actual term yoga start to appear in historical records?
Okay, so the word yoga itself, it does appear in ancient Indian texts. You find it in things like the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, among others.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In these very early texts, the term yoga carried, well, a whole range of meanings, not the specific set of associations it has today, especially, in the Western context.
A term with multiple layers, it sounds like. A bit slippery, maybe?
You could say that. What were some of its initial uses? Well, the Sanskrit root yuj is fundamental here.
Y-U-J.
Yes, Y-U-J. It's related to our English word yoke, so it signifies a joining or uniting, harnessing together.
Okay, like yoking oxen.
Sort of.
Yeah.
But interestingly, it could also signify something quite different, like arrow, implying focus and direction.
Huh. That's quite different.
It is. Sanskrit is a very nuanced language, so yoga naturally had this inherent flexibility in its early usage. The core idea, though, generally revolved around some form of connection or integration or maybe focused effort.
Connection or integration. Yeah. That gives us a basic sense. But how is that concept actually applied in those early writings? What do they mean by it in practice?
Well, in the early Upanishads, the meaning often seems quite abstract. It often refers to a specific state of mental stillness.
Ah, okay. A state of mind.
Yes. A goal achieved by quieting the senses and the intellect. For instance, the Hatha Upanishad, a famous one, states, when the five perceptions are still together with the mind and not even reason stirs itself, they call it the highest state.
Wow, okay. That's quite profound.
It is. And it goes on to say that this firm holding back of the senses is yoga, leading to freedom from distractions.
So at this very early stage, it's much more about mental discipline. Less about the physical postures we automatically associate with yoga now, right?
Precisely. That's a key point. While bodily practices may well have existed back then, we can't say for sure they didn't, the term yoga at this point. We're talking around the middle of the first millennium BCE. It primarily denoted either the state of mental quietude, the stillness, or it referred to a broader technique, a method for attaining that elevated state.
So both the goal and the path.
Exactly. Both the objective and the method were being referred to as yoga.
Intriguing. So while physical practices might have been happening maybe under different names or just as part of ascetic life, they weren't necessarily labeled as yoga in these key texts. What else was happening in India around that time? What was the context that could have shaped its development?
This is where the shamana movement becomes really significant.
Shaman.
Yes, Shamana. Around the same period the Upanishads were developing, there was this notable shift happening in the religious landscape of India. The traditional Vedic practices, which were very centered on external rituals, fire sacrifices, offerings.
Yeah, the older layer.
Yes, those started to face challenges from what we now call the Shamana movement.
Domana, I think I've heard the term, but maybe not super familiar. What was the essence of that movement? What were they about?
Well, the Shamana movement represented a move away from those external Vedic rituals. Its emphasis was much more on internal practices.
Ah.
Things like meditation, various austerities, self-discipline, all with the ultimate aim of achieving liberation, or moksha, from the cycle of birth and death.
So looking inward for answers.
Exactly. And think of key figures like Mahavira, who's considered the founder of Jainism, and Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha.
Of course.
They both emerged from this shaman environment. These individuals and the movements they started sometimes directly question the authority and, frankly, the efficacy of the traditional Vedic way.
So a real turning inward, focusing on personal effort, personal experience,
Yeah.
rather than just external rites.
Precisely. But it wasn't only about rejection. It's more complex. Other elements within this broad shamana movement seem to have integrated or maybe reinterpreted Vedic teachings, often by transforming those external rituals into internal kind of mental processes. And this development, this internalization, is considered to have played a really significant role in the composition of the later Upanishads themselves.
Okay, so a sort of spiritual melting pot of ideas back then. You had the Vedic tradition, you had the shamana groups pushing back or reinterpreting. Where does yoga or proto-yoga fit into this shamana picture?
Well, what's particularly interesting for our story is that within this broader shamana movement and among their various practices, we find some of the earliest clear examples of techniques that might resemble what we'd recognize as yoga-like practices today.
Okay, the seeds are there.
The seeds are definitely there. And importantly, these practices weren't exclusive to what later became neatly defined distinct traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, or Jainism.
Ah, so it was more fluid back then.
Very much so. In this early period, there was a lot of mutual influence and interaction. The precursors to yoga seem to have developed through this dynamic interplay.
Fascinating. And what were some of these early techniques? What did they actually do that foreshadowed later yoga?
A really key concept here was tapas. T-A-P-A-S.
Tapas.
It literally translates to something like heat or glow or austerity. These were various, often quite intense, self-imposed disciplines aimed at controlling and harnessing the body's energies.
Like what kind of disciplines?
Practices like prolonged fasting, maintaining celibacy, holding uncomfortable physical postures for long periods, breath control, that sort of thing. They were believed to generate this internal heat or energy,
Okay.
which was seen as having transformative, even purifying effects. As the scholar W. Talon noted way back, this heat wasn't just, physical warmth, but a kind of power generated through intense effort.
So these early practitioners were intentionally pushing their physical and mental boundaries to achieve something.
Yeah.
But what were their goals with this tapas? What were they trying to get out of it?
Well, the aims were actually quite diverse back then. They could range from trying to gain worldly benefits from the gods, maybe influence them, to acquiring supernatural abilities, what they called siddhis, things like levitation or becoming invisible, those kinds of powers.
Wow.
And ultimately, for many, the goal was achieving immortality or complete liberation, moksha. So while yoga as a specific term had these broader applications we talked about, these shamana practices, especially tapas, certainly laid some of the crucial foundational elements for later developments in what became yoga.
That's a really insightful connection. Okay, now, you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita earlier as another place the word yoga appears. How does the concept of yoga figure in that really, really influential text?
Right, the Bhagavad Gita. Likely composed somewhere between, say, 300 BCE and maybe 400 CE. The dating is debated, of course.
Always is.
Always is with ancient texts. But it's absolutely a central text in the Hindu tradition, and yes, yoga is a key theme running right through it. However, again, it's important to keep in mind that the term isn't always used in the way we might immediately expect based on contemporary yoga practice.
So the definition continues its evolution, still not fixed.
Precisely. In the Gita, yoga is often used almost synonymously with a path or a discipline, a particular approach to life and spiritual realization. Krishna, the divine figure in the Gita, in his teachings to the warrior Arjuna.
Right, the famous dialogue.
That's the one. He outlines several distinct yogas, several paths.
Different branches of yoga already within the Gita itself. That's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yes, absolutely. He speaks of karma yoga,
Okay.
which is the yoga of selfless action, doing your duty without attachment to the results. Then there's Jnana Yoga, sometimes spelled Gyana or Jnana, the yoga of knowledge and wisdom.
Right.
There's Jnana Yoga, which is the yoga of meditation, closer to the Upanishadic idea, perhaps. And very importantly, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of loving devotion to the divine, to God.
4 distinct paths. Is there a sense of one being better than others?
Well, there's often an implied hierarchy, yes. Depending on the interpretive tradition, Bhakti Yoga, that path of pure devotion, is frequently presented as the highest or maybe the most direct route to spiritual fulfillment in the context of the Gita.
Okay, so yoga here is less about specific techniques like postures or breathing exercises, and much more about a fundamental way of engaging with the world and with the spiritual, a whole orientation to life.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And even within the Gita itself, the word yoga pops up in different contexts with slightly different shades of meaning.
Like what?
Well, for instance, in that really powerful moment where Krishna reveals his terrifying, magnificent cosmic form to Arjuna,
Is Varupa?
yes, he refers to it as his lordly yoga, Aishvarya yoga. Here, yoga seems to signify his divine power, his magical manifestation.
Wow. Okay.
And then in another very well-known verse, Krishna states, yoga is skill in action. Yoga karmasu kashalam, which highlights a more, let's say, engaged and mindful approach to performing one's duties in the world effectively.
So the flexibility of the term persists, even within this single, incredibly foundational text. It can mean a path, a state, a power, skill.
It really demonstrates its adaptability.
Okay, so following the Upanishads and the Gita, what's the next really major step in this unfolding story of yoga? Where does it go from there?
The next really significant milestone, the one many people do associate directly with yoga, is the emergence of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali.
Ah, yes, Patanjali.
This text marks a crucial point. It's where many of the existing ideas about yoga, various ascetic practices, and significantly, the philosophical framework of a related school called Samkhya.
Samkhya, S-A-M-K-H-Y-A.
Yes, Samkhya. All these elements began to be systematically organized into a very concise and ultimately hugely influential work. It essentially codified yoga as a distinct school of philosophy and practice in a way that hadn't quite happened before.
Patanjali, a name that, you're right, for many people is practically synonymous with yoga today. But who was he exactly, and when did his work actually come about?
Well, like many ancient scholars, Patanjali remains a somewhat enigmatic historical figure. There's ongoing scholarly debate about his precise dating, and consequently, the exact period when the Yoga Sutras themselves were composed is also debated. But the current general consensus among scholars tends to place him around the 4th or perhaps 5th century CE. So the sutras likely date to roughly that time, although you'll still find arguments for earlier dates sometimes.
So a few centuries after the Bhagavad Gita likely reached its final form. What made the Yoga Sutras so foundational? Why are they considered such an important text?
Well, the Yoga Sutras played a vital role in establishing yoga as one of the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy. These are known as the darshanas.
Darshanas, okay.
While this specific categorization into 6 schools developed a bit later, and its strictness is certainly debated by modern scholars, it does reflect the increasing prominence of these distinct lines of thought and practice in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages in India. Each of these schools often had a primary text in the form of sutras, these incredibly concise, almost cryptic aphorisms.
Like bullet points almost.
Kind of, yeah. And they were typically accompanied by essential commentaries called bhashya, which explained the dense sutras.
And where did yoga, Patanjali's yoga, fit into this philosophical landscape? You mentioned its connection to Samkhya.
Yes, the Samkhya and yoga schools are very often described as sister traditions because they shared essentially the same metaphysical understanding of reality, many fundamental principles. You could almost think of Samkhya as providing the philosophical blueprint, the theory.
The what?
The what's, exactly. While yoga, Patanjali's yoga, offered the practical methods, the techniques.
The how.
The how to achieve liberation within that Samkhya framework.
And what was that shared metaphysical outlook? What were the core ideas they agreed upon? What was the what?
Okay, so at its core, it's a profoundly dualistic system.
Dualistic, meaning 2 fundamental principles.
Exactly. Samkhya philosophy posits that reality is made up of 2 fundamentally distinct and irreducible principles. Firstly, there's Purusha, which can be understood as pure consciousness, the true self, the seer, kind of similar to the concept of Atman in other schools. And secondly, there's prakriti,
Prakriti.
which is matter or nature in its broadest possible sense. And this is a strict dualism, very different from, say, the non-dualism of Advaita Vedanta, where everything is ultimately one.
So Purusha and Prakriti are fundamentally separate?
Fundamentally separate and distinct. Purusha is seen as our true, silent, unchanging, peaceful essence. But for most of us, we're entangled in Prakriti and its endless manifestations, its changes.
So the goal then is to disentangle ourselves from this matter, this Prakriti. But you mentioned Prakriti includes our thoughts and emotions. That sounds tricky.
It is, and that's crucial. In this context, Prakriti isn't just physical objects like rocks and trees, as we might think of matter today. It encompasses everything in the realm of experience and appearance. That includes our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, the ego, the intellect, the very workings of our minds.
Wow, okay, so pretty much everything we normally identify with.
Pretty much everything we normally think of as me or my experience falls under Prakriti. The ultimate aim, then, is to turn away from this identification with Prakriti and realize our true nature as Purusha, as pure, unbound, witnessing consciousness.
That's a profound goal.
You can think of Purusha as like the silent, uninvolved observer, maybe like the movie screen. And Prakriti is the ever-changing movie being projected upon it, the story, the characters, the emotions, the action. The goal is to recognize deeply that the screen is fundamentally separate from the film playing on it.
Okay, that analogy helps. That's the philosophical foundation. Now, how do the Yoga Sutras provide the practical steps, the how, to achieve this separation, this realization of Purusha?
Right. This is where Patanjali's famous definition of yoga comes in, Sutra 1.2. Yoga is the stilling of the changing states of the mind. Or, in Sanskrit, yoga chitta vritti nirodha.
Chitta vritti nirodha. Heard that one.
It's probably the most quoted sutra. The sutras essentially serve as a practical manual, a guidebook for achieving samadhi, which is a state of deep meditative consciousness, one that's free from those mental activities, those vrittis. And the ultimate goal beyond even samadhi is kaivalya,
Kaivalya.
meaning independence, isolation, liberation, that complete detachment of Purusha from Prakriti. As scholar Edwin F. Brand has noted, the Yoga Sutras are arguably more concerned with presenting a detailed psychology of the mind and an understanding of human consciousness than with laying out a comprehensive metaphysics of reality. It's fundamentally a practitioner's guide to plumbing the depths of consciousness.
So Patanjali was less concerned with maybe grand philosophical debates about the nature of the universe and much more focused on the practical how-to of achieving this very specific state of mental stillness and liberation.
In a very ancient, very focused sense, yes. And while his text was clearly composed by someone deeply embedded in Brahmanical scholarship and ascetic traditions, it also shows influences from various contemporary intellectual and spiritual currents. You can see elements possibly drawn from Yogacara Buddhism, from Jainism, and of course, very heavily from that Samkhya philosophical framework we discussed.
A synthesis again.
Very much so. As scholars James Mallinson and Mark Singleton have pointed out, the text, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, which includes the sutras and often the main commentary, can be interpreted perhaps as a Brahminical attempt to appropriate yoga from the Shamana traditions, kind of bringing these ascetic practices into a more orthodox philosophical fold.
Interesting perspective. So what are the core teachings outlined in those first few really crucial sutras? You mentioned stilling the mind.
The fundamental idea presented right there in the initial sutras is basically this. When the fluctuations of the mind, the vrittis, the mental chatter, the thoughts, emotions, perceptions, when they are stilled, nirodha,
Okay.
then the seer, that pure consciousness, Purusha or Atman, rests, abides, in its true, inherent, undisturbed nature.
And when the mind isn't still, which is most of the time for most people.
Exactly. Then the sutras say the seer mistakenly identifies with these mental fluctuations, with the vrittis. We think we are our thoughts, our anger, our desires. This leads to suffering, delusion, and a distorted sense of self.
Okay, that makes sense. And the method for actually stilling these fluctuations, that's where the famous 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga come in, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Patanjali outlines this systematic 8-limbed path, Ashtanga Yoga, as the practical means to achieve this quieting of the mind and eventual liberation.
Ashtanga meaning 8 limbs.
8 limbs, yes.
Right.
And these 8 limbs are progressive. They start with the yamas,
Yamas.
which are ethical restraints or abstinences, things like ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, truthfulness, asteya, non-stealing, brahmacharya, often translated as celibacy or moderation, and aparigraha, non-possessiveness, So a strong ethical foundation first.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second limb?
The second limb is the niyamas. These are observances or positive duties. Things like socha, purity or cleanliness, both internal and external, santosha, contentment, tapas, austerity or self-discipline, there's that word again.
Ah, tapas again.
Yes. Svadhyaya, self-study, including study of scriptures, and Ishvara pranitana, contemplation of or devotion to a higher power, Ishvara.
So a strong ethical and self-disciplinary foundation before you even get to anything else. What follows those?
Following these foundational limbs, the third limb is asana.
Asana, the postures. Finally.
Well, yes and no. Asana here refers to posture, but in Patanjali's specific context, it primarily means establishing a stable, steady, and comfortable seated posture for meditation.
Just sitting.
Primarily, yes.
Right.
The goal is to sit still without discomfort or distraction for long periods. Then comes the fourth limb, pranayama.
Breath control.
Exactly. The regulation and control of the breath, or prana, life force, considered a vital link between the body and mind. The fifth limb is pratyahara.
Pratyahara.
Which means withdrawal of the senses, learning to turn the attention inward, away from external distractions. And then the final three limbs are really the heart of the meditative practice itself.
Okay.
Sixth is dharana, which is concentration, fixing the mind on a single point or object. Seventh is dhyana, which is meditation or contemplation, an unbroken flow of concentration. And the eighth and final limb is samadhi.
The goal state we mentioned earlier.
Yes, absorption, integration, the state where the mind becomes completely still, and the distinction between the meditator and the object of meditation dissolves, leading towards that ultimate realization of purusha and kaivalya. Notice how the later limbs are progressively more internal, more subtle, more meditative.
It's really quite striking when you lay it out like that, how asana, the physical postures that we so strongly associate with the word yoga today, seem to have a relatively limited, almost preparatory role in Patanjali's original system.
That's a crucial insight, and often a surprising one for people familiar only with modern yoga. Patanjali's yoga is significantly more focused on mental discipline, ethics, and deep inner exploration. Asanas are primarily about establishing that steady, comfortable seat to facilitate prolonged meditation, not the dynamic flowing sequences or complex poses we often see in classes today.
You also mentioned the theistic aspect of the sutras earlier, the concept of Ishvara in the niyamas. How important is devotion to this higher power in Patanjali's path?
It's presented as quite significant. The sutras do emphasize the importance of devotion to Ishvara, which can be understood as a personal god, the supreme being, or perhaps a chosen ideal as a potentially powerful aid, maybe even a shortcut, on the path to achieving samadhi. So this theistic element is another key component of Patanjali's specific system. And while Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga became this incredibly foundational framework, it's also important to remember that it wasn't the end of the story. Later influential traditions, like Advaita Vedanta, for instance, adopted and adapted these yogic ideas, integrating them into their own distinct philosophical systems and goals.
So yoga continued to be adapted even after Patanjali. And were the Yoga Sutras themselves, immediately accessible and widely understood right after they were written? You said they were concise.
Not at all. Quite the opposite. Like many sutra texts from that era, they are incredibly dense, aphoristic, and often quite obscure. They really rely on a kind of intellectual shorthand common among scholars of the time.
So you needed a teacher or a commentary?
Absolutely. They pretty much necessitate extensive commentary to be properly unpacked, understood, and applied in practice. The traditional and most famous commentary, the Yoga Bhashya, is attributed to a sage named Vyasa, who might have lived shortly after Patanjali, or perhaps was even a contemporary. However, there's also a growing scholarly perspective, quite compelling actually, that suggests Patanjali himself may have authored his own bhashya, his own commentary on his sutras. The idea being that the sutras and this primary commentary were perhaps intended as a single integrated work from the beginning.
Interesting. So the teacher provided the textbook and the study guide.
Potentially, yes. Regardless of who wrote the first commentary, the long tradition of subsequent commentaries and sub-commentaries over the centuries has been absolutely essential for unlocking the depth and practical application of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
Okay, so we have this highly influential system from Patanjali, primarily focused on ethics, mental discipline, meditation, with asana playing that specific role of the meditation seat. How do we get from that to the yoga we commonly see today, with its much more prominent emphasis on a wide variety of physical postures? What happened next?
Right. That's a fascinating and absolutely pivotal transition in the long history of yoga. In the centuries following the Yoga Sutras, let's say from the early Middle Ages onwards, new ideas and new techniques began to emerge and gain traction within the broader yogic landscape of
Mainly
India.
developments.
Yes. This eventually led to the really significant development and flowering of what we now call Hatha Yoga, Hatha.
Hatha yoga. Okay, another term many people will recognize.
Definitely. It's often translated, though maybe imperfectly, as the yoga of force or forceful yoga. And this wasn't a complete break from earlier ideas, certainly not, but it represented a significant shift in emphasis and, crucially, in methodology.
Yoga of force. That certainly sounds quite different from Patanjali's stilling of the mind. What were the key factors that drove this shift towards Hatha yoga? Where did it come from?
Well, the development of Hatha Yoga is largely attributed by scholars now to a kind of synthesis, a bringing together of two major currents. Firstly, those older ascetic traditions with their strong focus on tapas and various bodily austerities that we discussed earlier.
Right, the shamana influence, the heat generation.
Exactly, that strand continued. And secondly, this was combined with the growing influence of a complex and widespread movement known as Tantra.
Tantra. Okay, a term that, as you hinted earlier, carries a lot of baggage and, frankly, misconceptions in the popular imagination.
Yeah.
What's essential for us to understand about Tantra in this context relating to Hatha yoga?
You're absolutely right. Tantra is often profoundly misunderstood in the West. While it's popularly, almost exclusively associated with sexuality, that's a very, very limited and frequently inaccurate portrayal of a vast and diverse tradition.
So what was it really about?
In broad terms, Tantra, which began to emerge maybe around the second half of the first millennium CE, maybe a bit earlier, it generally viewed the physical body not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a microcosm of the universe itself, and as a potential vehicle for achieving spiritual realization.
A very different view from the strict dualism of Samkhya yoga.
Very different. Unlike the Samkhya philosophy that saw the material world, Prakriti as fundamentally separate from and lower than the spiritual, Purusha, Tantra often posited that the material world itself is divine. It's seen as a manifestation of a dynamic, creative, feminine energy, often called Shakti.
So a much more embodied approach to spirituality.
Yeah.
Embracing the physical rather than just seeking to transcend it.
Exactly. That's a key distinction. Rather than seeking liberation solely through mental detachment from the world, Tantra often advocated for using the body, its senses, and its inherent energies as powerful tools for achieving enlightenment or liberation.
How did that translate into practices?
Well, this worldview led to the development and elaboration of new ideas about the subtle body. Concepts like chakras, these swirling energy centers within the body.
The energy centers, right?
Yes, and nadis, subtle energy channels through which life force flows. And perhaps most famously, the concept of kundalini.
Kundalini energy.
Yes, often depicted as a coiled serpent, a latent, powerful divine energy believed to reside at the base of the spine, which could be awakened and raised up through the chakras through specific practices.
Okay, so this tantric worldview, with its focus on the body, energy, and specific techniques, this directly influenced the development of Hatha yoga and its characteristic emphasis on physical practices.
Absolutely, and decisively so. Tantra, which wasn't a single monolithic religion, but rather a widespread current or movement influencing various traditions, including Shaiva and Vaishnava Hinduism, certain forms of Buddhism like Vajrayana, and even Jainism played a absolutely crucial role in the development of both Hatha yoga and, later, modern postural yoga.
So the roots of many yoga poses lie in Tantra.
Many of the techniques we now strongly associate with yoga, particularly the physical postures, asanas beyond just sitting, complex breath control exercises, pranayama, and energy seals or locks, mudras and bendals, have significant roots in tantric practices and worldviews. In fact, recent scholarship has even highlighted the likely early influence of specifically Buddhist Tantra on the formation of Hatha yoga. Texts like the Amrita Siddhi, possibly dating to the 11th or 12th century, have been identified as potentially some of the earliest Hatha yoga texts, and they show strong Buddhist tantric connections.
That's fascinating. So Hatha yoga, with its focus on asanas and this embodied spirituality, was a really significant innovation, a new kind of synthesis in the long evolution of yoga.
Precisely. Hatha yoga, with its renewed emphasis on a wider range of asanas and a kind of revival or refinement of ascetic bodily practices linked to tapas, became a absolutely crucial step in the development of yoga as we generally understand it today. Its methods were often presented, interestingly, as either a necessary preparatory stage for the higher meditative states of Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga.
Preparing the body.
Exactly. Or sometimes even presented as an easier, more accessible alternative path altogether. Hatha Yoga introduced, or at least systemized and emphasized, unique techniques such as various internal cleansing practices, shatkarmas, a much wider repertoire of non-seated postures, more complex and forceful pranayama techniques, and those mudras and bandha-specific hand gestures, body locks, and energy seals intended to direct the flow of prana.
And do we start to see more texts specifically dedicated to these kinds of Hatha Yoga practices emerging during the Middle Ages, distinct from the Yoga Sutras?
Yes, there's a clear and marked increase in the production of dedicated Hatha Yoga texts during this period, say from the 11th or 12th century onwards. Key examples that are often cited as foundational include the 13th century Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which lists quite a few asanas, and the very influential 15th century Hatha Yoga Pradipika by Svatmarama. This text in particular became a cornerstone, providing detailed descriptions of various asanas, pranayama, mudras, and other Hatha Yoga techniques.
It sounds like yoga was becoming increasingly diverse and adaptable, branching out in these new, more physical directions, while the older meditative traditions also continued.
That's a key observation, absolutely. While these Hatha Yoga texts often arose within specific religious or philosophical contexts, sometimes Shaiva, sometimes Vaishnava, sometimes linked to Nath yogis,
Right.
they frequently adopted a relatively non-sectarian approach in their actual presentation of the methods. They focused on techniques that could, in theory, be practiced by individuals from various religious and philosophical backgrounds, whether they were Shaiva, Vaishnava, Buddhist, Jain, or perhaps belonged to other ascetic groups. Yoga, in its essence, throughout its long history, has always demonstrated this remarkable capacity for malleability, for being adopted and adapted by numerous schools of thought and practice.
That adaptability seems key. Now, as Hatha Yoga continued to develop and gain prominence within India, especially in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, it must have encountered other significant cultural and religious influences, right? Particularly with the arrival and eventual spread of Islam in the subcontinent. How did that interaction play out?
That's a really important and, I think, often overlooked aspect of yoga's complex history. You're right, as Hatha Yoga gained prominence, it coincided with the increasing presence and eventually political dominance of Islam in large parts of the Indian subcontinent. And what's fascinating is the significant level of intellectual, cultural, and even practical exchange that occurred between elements of Hinduism and Islam for centuries, especially during periods like the Mughal Empire.
A surprising degree of interaction, perhaps. More than we might assume, given some modern narratives about conflict.
Indeed. At certain levels, particularly among Sufi mystics and some Hindu scholars and yogis, we see numerous examples of open dialogue, mutual influence, and even shared understanding. It wasn't all conflict by any means. Even much earlier, back in the 11th century, the renowned Persian Muslim scholar al-Biruni, who spent considerable time in India,
Al-Biruni, right?
he actually produced an Arabic translation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which indicates a really early intellectual curiosity and serious engagement with Hindu philosophical systems from the Muslim world.
Wow, 11th century, that is early. And how did this interaction manifest later, maybe in the actual practice or understanding of yoga itself, particularly Hatha Yoga?
Well, we see some Sufi writers, like the famous Persian poet and mystic Abdurrahman al-Jami in the 15th century, who actually wrote commentaries on Hindu texts like the Bhagavad Gita.
Really? A Sufi commenting on the Gita?
Yes. And at times, some Sufis theorized about possible shared prophetic origins between traditions, or at least recognized profound value and wisdom in Hindu spiritual teachings. There's also a notable recognition, particularly among more philosophically inclined Sufis, of certain parallels between Sufi mystical concepts such as Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of being, and the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, to the point where some Muslims even viewed educated Hindus, particularly Advaitins, as essentially being Indian monotheists.
That's a really interesting perspective, suggesting not just tolerance, but maybe a genuine attempt at finding common ground, a synthesis of ideas.
In certain intellectual and spiritual circles, absolutely. And perhaps the most striking and tangible example of this kind of Islamic yoga, or perhaps yogic influence on Sufism, comes from the 16th century. There was a prominent Sufi master named Muhammad Gauth Gwaliari.
Muhammad Gauth.
He belonged to the Shatari Sufi order, known for its emphasis on ascetic practices. And he's renowned for his Persian work called Bahr al-Hayat.
Bahr al-Hayat. What does that mean?
It translates as the ocean of life, or the water of life. And this text is fascinating because it appears to be based, at least in part, on an earlier Arabic translation of a now apparently lost Sanskrit yogic text, possibly called the Amritakunda, the pool of nectar.
So a translation of a translation, potential?
Potentially, yes. And the Bahr al-Hayat provides these detailed descriptions of various yogic meditative practices, breath control, and significantly, it includes descriptions and even beautiful illustrations depicting yogis performing a considerable number of asanas, physical postures.
Wow, so visual evidence of Sufis engaging directly with and documenting Hatha yoga postures in the 16th century.
Exactly. It's a remarkable testament to this cross-cultural exchange happening at the level of physical and spiritual practice. And while we can't delve too deeply into it right here, this historical interaction of yoga with other major traditions, including much later encounters with Christianity starting in the colonial and modern eras, further contributed to its ongoing evolution, adaptation, and transformation.
Okay, so that brings us closer to the modern era. From its ancient roots in India, evolving through Upanishadic thought, Shamana practices, the Gita, Patanjali systematization, the rise of Tantra and Hatha Yoga, and even interactions with Islam, we finally arrive at the point where yoga journeys decisively to the Western world. How did that happen, and how did it evolve into the forms we are most familiar with today in, say, Europe and North America?
Right. Yoga's arrival and subsequent, really quite explosive surge in popularity in the Western world, mainly during the 19th and especially the 20th centuries, marked another huge chapter in its transformation. Swami Vivekananda's visit to the West, particularly his appearance at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, was a crucial early catalyst. He presented yoga primarily as philosophy and meditation, Raja Yoga.
Vivekananda, okay. A key figure.
A very key figure in introducing Hindu thought. However, when we look at the postural yoga that dominates today, Mark Singleton's groundbreaking book, Yoga Body, The Origins of Modern Posture Practice, published in 2010, offers a really compelling and, for some, controversial perspective. He argues that modern postural yoga, the kind you mostly see in studios, is largely a syncretic creation.
Syncretism, again, that blending of different traditions. We saw that with Hatha Yoga. What were the key elements being combined in this case, according to Singleton?
Singleton argues, quite convincingly, I think, that it's a blend between, on the one hand, the existing Hatha Yoga traditions that had developed in India, though maybe not always the most mainstream or elite forms.
Okay.
And on the other hand, various Western practices that were becoming popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Things like European gymnastics, bodybuilding, physical culture movements, even military calisthenics, as well as similar physical culture developments happening within modernizing India itself.
That's fascinating. So Western gymnastics influencing modern yoga.
That's a big part of his argument. And interestingly, he points out that in 19th and early 20th century India, Hatha Yoga, particularly its more extreme postural forms, was sometimes viewed with a degree of skepticism, even disdain, by some elites. It was often associated more with itinerant yogis, street performers, or acrobats, in contrast to the more traditionally respected meditative or philosophical forms of yoga.
So the West, in a sense, rediscovered or perhaps rebranded and significantly re-emphasized the physical, postural aspects of yoga, maybe elevating their status.
To a large extent, yes, that seems to be part of the story. Key Indian figures in the 20th century, like Tirumalai Krishnamacharya and his famous students, including Pattabhi Joy, founder of Ashtanga Vinyasa, and BKS Iyengar, as well as others like Paramahansa Yogananda.
Very influential names.
Hugely influential. They played pivotal roles in reshaping, adapting, and promoting yoga, particularly Hatha Yoga, for a modern, global, and increasingly Western audience. And this often involved a much greater emphasis being placed on the performance of physical postures, sequences, and alignment.
So it wasn't just a simple import-export.
Not at all. Singleton characterizes this emergence of modern posture-based yoga not as a direct, unbroken lineage from ancient Hatha yoga, but more as a dialogical exchange, a dynamic interaction between Indian traditions and global modernity, including Western physical culture. It's a really fascinating example of how cultural exchange constantly shapes and reshapes practices.
A dialogical exchange, that's a very apt description, isn't it? It suggests it wasn't simply a one-way transmission of some pure ancient practice. There was influence flowing in both directions, conscious adaptation.
Precisely. And Singleton is also careful to emphasize, importantly, that acknowledging this complex history doesn't necessarily diminish the potential for profound experiences, physical benefits, or even deep spiritual depth within modern posture-based yoga. It's just a more accurate historical picture.
Yeah, it gives context.
Exactly. The history of modern physical culture in the West itself, it intersected with various spiritual, medical, esoteric, and social movements. Think of things like the physical culture movement in Scandinavia, German neck culture, bodybuilding. All of this created a kind of fertile ground for this particular evolution and reception of yoga in the West. And then, of course, Western social and political developments like the counterculture movement of the 1960s, seeking alternative spiritualities, and later a growing societal focus on physical fitness and wellness, also played really significant roles in its widespread adoption.
And now, as we said at the start, we see yoga studios seemingly on every corner, certainly in many parts of the world. It's become incredibly mainstream and also, let's face it, highly commercialized.
Absolutely. And with this widespread adoption and commercialization has come, maybe inevitably, these ongoing debates about the fundamental nature of yoga itself. Is it primarily a religion? Is it a spiritual practice? Is it simply a form of exercise? Or is it some combination? And can these categories even be neatly separated when we look at yoga?
It's a constant discussion.
It really is. And you see this reflected in the real world. We see examples ranging from certain Christian authorities expressing concerns or even condemning yoga because of its Hindu origins.
Right.
All the way to churches actively hosting yoga classes in their basements, perhaps framing it purely as physical exercise or stress relief. It highlights the incredibly diverse and often conflicting perceptions out there.
It's fascinating how differently individuals and communities interpret it, isn't it?
Yep.
You mentioned in the source material that anecdote about someone being uncomfortable with the mention of Jesus in a yoga studio, feeling it was inappropriate, while being perfectly fine with Sanskrit chanting or statues of Hindu deities.
Yes, that anecdote really underscores the complex, sometimes contradictory ways people navigate the intersection of religion, spirituality, culture, and yoga in contemporary society. What feels religious or spiritual versus cultural or secular is very subjective.
It really is.
Yeah.
And while some studios and teachers today actively try to de-emphasize or even consciously strip out the Indic or Hindu references from their practice, maybe avoiding Sanskrit terms, omitting chanting, focusing only on the physical.
Right, trying to make it purely secular exercise.
Exactly. It raises the really complex question of whether that can ever be fully or even meaningfully accomplished, given yoga's incredibly deep and undeniable historical and philosophical roots in those traditions. Can you really separate the how from the why and where it came from?
That's a huge question. And related to that, of course, are the understandable concerns and feelings expressed by some within the Hindu community and by others regarding cultural appropriation and the sometimes crass commercialization of what they view as a sacred tradition.
Very valid concerns.
Yeah.
So it seems yoga continues its evolutionary journey, adapting and changing as it spreads globally, and these questions surrounding its identity, its ownership, its authenticity, they are likely to remain relevant and debated for a long time to come.
I think that's exactly right. Yoga has always, as we've seen, been this remarkably adaptable, resilient tradition. It has flourished precisely through its interactions with different cultures, philosophies, and belief systems over millennia. The questions of who gets to define what true yoga is, and perhaps even more contentiously, to whom it ultimately belongs, these are incredibly complex and likely don't have simple, definitive answers.
This has been such an illuminating deep dive, really tracing that long, winding path from ancient India to the studio down the street to try and bring it all together. What would you say are the key takeaways for us, for the listener, to remember from this whole exploration?
I think the core message really is that yoga possesses this long, incredibly intricate, and profoundly diverse history. It has evolved significantly, constantly from its ancient Indian origins, moving through centuries of engagement and dialogue with various religious, philosophical, and cultural traditions. It wasn't static. And that journey eventually led to its multifaceted, modern global presence. It's crucial to understand that it's not some static, monolithic entity that's remained unchanged for 5,000 years. That's a myth. It's actually a dynamic, fluid, and remarkably adaptable collection of practices, philosophies, and worldviews.
It certainly challenges any simplistic understanding, doesn't it? Whether you see it as just exercise or as some single unchanging ancient wisdom, the reality is much richer and messier.
Much richer, much messier, and frankly, much more interesting.
Absolutely. And on that note, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up. Given yoga's incredibly rich history of syncretism, borrowing, adaptation, and transformation that we've traced, what might its ongoing evolution in the 21st century within our increasingly interconnected, digital, diverse global landscape, what might that signify for its future identity and for its continuing relationship with both its ancient roots and its ever-expanding new global contexts?
That's a great question to ponder. Where does it go from here?
Yes, exactly. Definitely something to contemplate. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.